Right.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Ayin Beis, volume 3. And I do remember the page. It's page 1302 is where we're up to, where we left off a while back. And we'll get right back into it. So just to refresh myself and refresh everybody, yes, indeed, we are in the middle of the overall theme is the transformation, not just the elimination, but the transformation of the negative into the positive. Or in the words of Ayin Beis, that the tzimtzum itself, einoid, that the concealment itself is transformed. Not only does, in other words, become a channel to reveal Havaya Walakim, but it itself reveals the divine power to conceal, which is also a divine power. And indeed, it's even a higher level of Elokus, because it's revealing, we learned the Helam and the Helam Ma'atzmi, the concealed of the divine and the fundamental concealed, all the way to Atzmus Ein Sof, the words of the Maimer here in Ayin Beis. And in the language that he's been using, Havai Yechat Merivov, so like he asked the question on page, he asked the question all the way at the beginning of this volume, but also on page 1298, where he said, Adain Yesh Lahavin, Yechatu means to eliminate, to shatter, the Yishbaru. But that's not the goal, is also Shenepach, that the prosecution should turn into defense. Kateged Saneged, Shenepach HaKateged Saneged. So that's what we're in the middle of explaining, that it's not just eliminating, but it's actually transforming. And that's the second half of the verse. Avay Yechat Merivov comes afterwards, he says, V'yitan oiz l'malkei v'yorim Keren Mashiach. And I'm looking now at page 1299, just summing up, that these two expressions refer, V'yitan oiz l'malkei is giving strength to Malchus from Azah, that's the Amshacha of Zah. Like he said, V'yitan oiz l'malkei b'chamshacha meb'chin Zah, ba'atarash yitra le'imoi. Amshacha ta'atpam b'chin atzmus and shosh shalamayla megeder ishtalshlus, into Malchus, but there's a higher level, the Yorim Keren Mashiach, which, like he says afterwards, this is all based on the Zohar. He says, then afterwards he says that this is Gili Gam B'chinas Zah. Okay, the Yorim Keren Mashiach, I'm showing B'chinas Malchus, B'chinas Helam Atzmi, the Ein Sof Mamish, because still coming from Zah is still not the highest level. This is from the Helam Atzmi. Malchus Tia B'chinas Er V'Gili Mitzad Atzmi. And that's v'yadam Keren Mashiach. Keren is etzem. The etzem of Malchus, Yisreim v'yisa'al ba'ilei yesed. And that is that Malchus on its own is etzem choshuch. On its own is fundamentally a state of concealment, like the moon. And that will become a level of from Helam Ha'atzmi. Okay. And that's even higher, as he says afterwards. But that biti will become higher even than imi. Biti, Malchus will become even higher than imi, which is bina. That's at the bottom of page 1299. If everybody can just mute to make it a little easier here. Okay, that's end with 1299. Then on 1230, I'm sorry, not 12. What did I say? 1299. On 1300, the Rebbe Rashab began to explain what this means. Bas is the level of Eved, Aved of Eved, and explains how the Eved, which is the lowest level of Aved in Giluyim, it's lower than the ministers, the Sar. But in Etzem, it reaches all the way to the highest level. So Berurim down below, even though the Berurim themselves is in Giluyim a lower level, but it reaches the Etzem. And that sums up essentially page 1300 and 1301. Not going into all the details right now. The next paragraph, which is what we're in the middle of, he goes back to Vayorim Keren Mashiach and explains that Keren has several interpretations. 4 to be exact. One from the word take of a chesed, intensity and strength. The second from the word etzem, like we said before on the bottom of page 1299. Etzem. The third interpretation on top of page 1302 I'm looking at is Lashon Zayar v'Oyer, illumination, shining, glow, like Keren Pnei Moshe. And the fourth, which is the one he actually elaborates on, from the word Keren Zovius, like a corner. See, a Keren Zovius is where two sides come and meet. So this is what we were in the middle of, and explaining what is this level where two things meet, where on one hand, it doesn't have any space of its own. It's only the meeting point, the place where two things converge. I'll start reading, even though we learned this, but just for my own refreshing, and I hope for everybody, nothing won't hurt to read it again. So I'm going to start learning inside from this, from the top of the page, line number line 2 actually. So it says, so it comes from the word Keren Zovius, so he's going to explain what Keren Zovius is. So if you remember this from last time we learned it, great. If not, doesn't hurt, as I said, I'm saying, and even if you remember, it doesn't hurt to learn it again. So we'll just have the flow. But keep in mind, this is all coming to explain by Yoram Keren Mishiche, which is Yoram Keren Mishiche, that Malchus, the highest level of transformation, not just the Giluyim are nimshech into Malchus, that Zah goes also into Malchus and elevates it, but also Malchus itself, even in its so-called concealed state, will become a tremendous revelation of the divine when Mashiach comes. Lost love. So he's explaining now the diak of the word Keren Mashiach. From the fourth interpretation, Keren Zovi. So he says like this. Hine. So I'm reading the second line on page 1302. All these pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. If you want to follow the text in PDF. It says, V'hine, ha-Keren Zovius, hu ha-mechaber beis kaislim. The corner, Keren Zovius, Zovius are sides, and Keren is where they meet. It connects two walls, two sides. So if you had, like he says, Ukumei v'Keren dremes mizrachis. Like you find in Chumash and Tanakh, you find Keren dremes mizrachis means the southeast corner. So we say the southeast corner means the corner where south and east meet. The southeast corner. As a matter of fact, the southeast corner is where the Rabbeim, the Rebbe and the Rabbeim would sit by davening. The Rebbe sat in the southeast corner. Mizrach, but in the south corner, the 770, and the same as all the Rabbeim, just for the record. So Keren Dremes Mizrachis, Hu Zovius. So that's the two sides, are the south and the east. V'hainu shnei ksolim hamischabrim yachad. So here's where they meet. It's like a right angle. So the south meets the east. Oz nikra Zovius shebehem Keren. So when they meet, if you're just talking about them without meeting, so you have the south side, you have the east side. Doesn't mean that they're a corner. There are plenty of things that are, when you say something is south, it doesn't mean it's southeast. It doesn't mean where the south meets the east. When you say the south meets the east, he says that's what's called Keren. Hazovius shebehem Keren. The sides where they meet is called a Keren. Ubelechi burim yachad, and if they did not join, kasher kol echad b'fnei atzmei, when each one is on their own, the south side and the east side, and let's say the east is here, the south is here, we're not talking about where they meet. Just like, for example, let's say in a building, let's talk in 770. There's a southern wall, the whole back of 770 is the southern wall. The east is the Mizrach wall, where the Aron Kodesh is. So when they don't meet, when everyone is on their own, and when they're not connecting to the second wall, then you can't call them Zovius, either one of them, because they haven't met. So you can't call it Keren Zovius. You could just say there's the Tzad HaDorim and Tzad HaMizrach. Rak nikrik say, one second. The only thing you could say that there's an end to the wall, which is the end of that particular wall that limits it. You could say the southern wall, for example, you could say is 10 feet long, or the eastern wall is 20 feet long. That's it. If you want to call it Keren Zovius, Ki'im Kishemischabim Shnei Aksolim, Darim u'Mizrach. Rather, when they connect and they join and they meet, the two walls, the southern and the eastern wall, Yachad, together, Ozai b'mokim chiburam, now a new entity is created. In the place where they join, Neilet Zovius v'hu Keren Dreimis Mizrachis. Now you have a corner, and that's the Keren Dreimis Mizrachis, the southeast corner. What I'm not clear about in Hebrew, maybe somebody can help, maybe Rab Shleima. So what's the difference between Keren and Zovius? What do you need both words? If Zovius means the corner, what does Keren add? Keren Zovius means the point of the corner?
Yeah,
not sure.
I think so. I think the Keren is the point.
The point. And the Zovius is the corner. Yeah, that's most likely. In other words, you can't talk about a corner unless two things meet. To have a southern wall and an eastern wall, they don't necessarily, if they're not meeting, you can't call them a corner. And the Keren is the point where the corner exactly takes place. That's most likely correct. The Keren Mizrachis, so it says, that's why you can't call it Shein Shabin Shum Zovius, B'Shemechem. You can't enter on a corner, right? Okay. Now, all this arichas, all this elaboration is not stamazeh. The Rebbe Rashab isn't just elaborating on geometric patterns here. He wants to explain that this is a level in Ruchnius. When we get back to Yoram Keren Meshiche, that Keren, like the level of Malchus, as we'll learn shortly, as we learned, is a level of bittul, that it itself doesn't have space, but it joins two things together. So we'll learn that in a moment. But that's the elaboration, is the mashal, is an explanation, is an example to explain something, a deep concept here. Okay, so who Keren dreams V'harei b'chiburam yachad. So now, when they're joining together, lo niseisu b'hem shum davar. So here's the interesting point. Even though a new entity was created, which is called the corner, the point of the corner, but nothing was added in essence. Nothing was added. Lo niseisu shum davar. Afal became obvious, and nevertheless, this gave birth to this. From this emerged a corner. So nothing was added. The south wall didn't become longer. The east wall didn't become longer. They didn't change. They just met. The place where they meet creates a new entity. So on one hand, it's something new. On the other hand, it doesn't have any substance. So what do we derive from this? That the Keren, the corner, or the point, is not a dover b'fnei atzmei klal. It doesn't have any. It doesn't have any identity of its own. B'chinas ayin. It's essentially a level of ayin, what we call in Chassidus ayin. Like I discussed the last time we learned this, one of the last classes, I explained that the same thing in time, the bein hashmoshes, that there's an opinion that bein hashmoshes, where day meets night, twilight, is not an entity of its own. It's just where day meets night. There are different opinions on the matter. We spoke about the Ragatshava. But the concept is, there is a concept where two things meet. There's no new entity, but there's the meeting point creates something. So he calls this the level of ayin. Because there's no additional space here. As long as the southern wall extends, it's called south. And as long as the eastern wall extends, that's east. So the eastern wall has not, the Keren doesn't add a new space. The eastern wall is still the eastern wall. The southern wall is still the southern wall. They just meet at a certain point. However, the only thing is this Keren, this point, comes automatically, the mischabris shnei hadvarim neilad hakeren, that from the joining of two things emerges the Keren, the corner, the corner point. That's the good word. Corner point. And nothing was added here. The only thing was added was the fact that two things joined. That's the chiddush here. That before they joined, you don't have this corner point. Now they've joined. So based on this, the Keren, the corner point, is what joins them together. So we have an entity here that doesn't have any space of its own, and yet it creates a joining of two separate entities. And without that Keren's obvious, you wouldn't have that joining. So obviously we need to understand what the significance of this is, which he's going to explain. But he explained it now, at least on a basic geometric level. So we understand it on that level. Okay. Now he's going to elaborate on, okay, so what is this example? Why do we need this example? What does this example teach us? So he says, this example will be understood above. We'll understand now from taking this physical example, how it is in our physical world, where two walls meet. And there's that level that nothing is added, but at the same time, it joined two things. So you understand, Lamaila, the Keren hu b'chinas Malchus. Keren, it refers to the level of Malchus. So when we say Malchus of Atzilus, or we'll soon learn Malchus of all levels, but Malchus is a level that he's going to explain now that on one hand doesn't have anything of its own. Expression, les la megama klum. It has nothing of its own. That's the language, that's the expression in Zayah. And yet it joins two worlds, Atzilus and Beriah. So he says like this, it's not an entity of its own, just like a Keren.
You mean it joins Atik? You mean it joins Atik and Beriah? He said it joins Atzilus and Beriah.
We'll see what he says. We'll see what he says. Lesla megamo klum. It has nothing of its own. Zulas mashisim Atzilus ba'atik leBeriah. Accept the fact that it's the end of Atzilus and the beginning or Atik of Beriah. Because Malchus becomes Atik of Beriah, like it is in every case. So it's the place where Atzilus and Beriah meet. So it's like exactly like a corner. Just like we said before, the south and east on their own are two entities. Then they meet. There's a new idea, new concept, a new idea, something emerges called a corner point. Malchus is that corner point. It has nothing of its own. So you could have, for example, you see, let's say in plumbing or in electricity, you can have that you graft together two pipes with a third pipe. Like, you'll see many times that pipes meet. So the plumber will create, there's a third entity that joins them together. It fastens them together. That's not the case here. In a corner, nothing, there's no third entity that's fastening them together. It's a level, like you said, Ayin, which we'll explain, that's where they join, that's where they meet. There's no third entity here, no separate entity. That is Malchus. Atzilus and Atik. But before obviously, he's going to explain now more at length what this means, and then come to the conclusion. This will continue on, by the way, for a while. If you look at the next page, you see it talks about his Ayin Beis Madregas. So this is going to go for a good few pages, I think, at least 2-3 pages. But we're going to come away with understanding what Malchus is, and understanding Vayorim Keren Mishiche, the Chiddush, that Malchus becomes elevated to the point that even higher than Imi, like he said, even higher than Bina and higher than Zah, as it reveals the Helam Atzmi of Atzmus. So keep in mind this. In Giluyim, I'll just say this because it may help put things in context. In Giluyim by definition means they're an entity that is Teifas Mokim. They have value. When you say, for example, the southern wall is an entity. When you say the eastern wall is an entity, that is Giluyim. So Zah has an identity of its own. Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesod, Bina, Chochma, all levels have an entity. They're defined by something. all the way to the highest levels. When you talk about Helema Atzmi of Atzmus, there you're talking about something that doesn't have an identity because it's a Helem. It doesn't manifest in any way. We discussed this at length, what that means, because God doesn't need to manifest in anything. Gilui, by definition, means it's an expression of something. Expression, as soon as you say expression, you immediately ask, what kind of expression? It could even be an expression of bli gvul. Fine, that's also an expression. You could see an expression of pshitus ha'ir, of shapeless and seamless light. Fine, but it's still an expression. It's oir, it's a gili, no matter even of the highest levels. What we're talking about in Malchus, what he's really going to come away to say that there's an entity in existence that on its own does not have any expression. At the same time, it has something that's more powerful than every expression. And that's, I'm just summing up where he's going to go with this, which of course is critical in understanding the whole idea that when we come to transforming this world, the Ein Eid, even the Tzimtzum in a way is very opposite of Oir. Oir is Giluyim. It says Oir Ein Sof, the infinite light filled everything. And that's why there was no room for existence. For there to be existence, God concealed the light. Concealment, in many ways, doesn't have substance. It's concealing, it's not revealing. The truth is, it also has substance because it's the power of God to conceal. But from the perspective of the viewer, from the perspective of us, when we look at it, it's concealment. Yes, the concealment is in order to bring revelation, but the very concealment itself is like Malchus. It's a state of a non-substance state, like an ayin. And yet this ayin, it itself is going to reveal even a higher level of divine, even more than all the giluyim, which will ultimately come to explain that this lowest of worlds, Dira B'Tachtenim, in Atzilus there's giluyim galore. You have Chachma, Bina, Das, you have Iyu v'Chayu Echad. Even in Beriah, Yitzir, Nasi, you have giluyim. You have the Malachim, you have the Neshamas. They learn Torah. There's Gili Elikus there. Question is how much Gili Elikus, but it's still there's revelation. Like we learned at length about Gan Eden. In this world, you could argue there's no revelation altogether. It's a Tachtenim, Tachten Shein Tachten Lamatim Menu. The words of the Alter Rebbe in chapter 36, the lowest of worlds, and he explains what that means. Lowest not in space, but in concealment. Godliness is completely concealed to the point that somebody can defy God and say, Aniva Afsi'ed, Mole Klippes V'Sitra Achra, to the point Aniva Afsi'ed, me and nothing else. The exact opposite of the truth. The truth is Ein Eid Milvade. There's nothing but God. And a person here in this world can say there's nothing but me. I don't need God. That's how dark it is. So you could say that this world will ultimately become a keli. As we do mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs, we reveal godliness, it'll become a keli to godliness. But what about that very concealment that we have endured for so long until Mashiach comes? So the ultimate chiddush in Ayin Beis in this volume is going to be that even the very darkness itself is the ultimate revelation of the divine. That's why it's such a chiddush. In Atzilus, you have Giluyim, but you don't never have a state of concealment. You never have a state of ayin in these words where there's no substance. And here you do have a level like that, which is rooted in Malchus, which is rooted in the Helema Atzmi. So I'm giving somewhat of a preview of what we're going to be learning. I just wanted to put it into broader context. So we not just get lost at sea here. As we're learning all these details, you could start thinking it seems tangential. It's not tangential at all. This V'yoram Keren Mishiche. And the Keren part that he's explaining now is going to explain a fundamental piece in the transformation of nothingness, so to speak, of ayin, or like he says here, ein davar b'fnei atzmei, but that in turn is going to reveal something that nothing else can reveal, which is the joining of the Geluyim of the south and east in the example. So it's just somewhat of a overview of it. But now I'll continue with learning inside. And I will stop. We're not changing our custom. I'll stop shortly for any questions. You know what? Actually, now is a good place to stop if anybody wants to ask anything. Because going further now, he's going to explain Malchus more in detail. How Malchus works in this context to explain the correlation between Malchus and Keren. Because we established now that Keren has nothing of its own, and yet it joins All it is joining two realities. Same thing here. Malchus is nothing of its own, but it joins Atzilus to Atik of Beriah. So before I read on, if anybody wants to ask anything, now is a fine time.
Yeah, Rabbi Jacobson. First, I'd just like to say that explanation today was an aliyah compared to even before our hefzik here. It was beautiful. So
okay,
you have more kochos than that was really.
Listen, I'm learning from the Rebbe in 1987, and he had 1977. Sorry, when he had the heart attack in Shmini Atzeres. So that's exactly what happened. I saw it with my own eyes. I was 20 years old then, and I saw how the Rebbe took adversity and transformed it into much greater growth. I mean, you can't even compare the Rebbe before the heart attack to afterwards. In the following years, when I began to write Farbrengens, was in 1979, literally a year and a half later. It literally, the output of the Rebbe, both quantitatively and qualitatively, almost doubled. I'm not exaggerating. Literally, Farbrengens that used to go till 4 o'clock, 4:30, went till 6:30. And the work I had to do was much harder because of the length and the breadth of the Farbrengens, and not just the Farbrengens, the activity, Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the Rebbe began, Sivas Hashem, Sefer Torah, all kinds of new stuff. So this I saw with my own eyes, with the Rebbe how that transforms. So I have a living example of how to behave. So I've got a model to follow.
That's exactly what we're learning here, right? Transforming concealment into
yeah,
the higher.
And it's the hardest thing to do, because it's one thing to get beyond concealment and say, okay, let's move on. It's another is to transform concealment. You know, it's interesting in the letter of the Rebbe, the famous letter to Ben Tzvi, president of Israel, the famous letter everybody quotes, where he explains to Ben Tzvi why he doesn't call him Nasi, because the Hebrew word for president is Nasi of Medinas Israel or Eretz Israel. And the Rebbe said, the reason is because since I'm a young child, I always envisioned what the real Nasi would be, Mashiach. But the interesting line that I was always struck by was, he says, a time will come when we will be able to understand why all the tsaros, the ki Hashem ki anafta bi, that we will thank God for afflicting us, for hurting us, that we'll be able to understand how the hurt itself, the darkness itself, was a deep divine revelation. Of all things, the Rebbe chooses that because the hardest thing to understand is pain and suffering. Let's be honest. Everything else you can explain is that, but to understand the Holocaust on a global, on a collective scale or a personal scale, that is the single hardest thing that no one has ever wrapped their head around. Not Moshe Rabbeinu and not Avram Avinu. This is where we all get stuck. We all remain silenced when it comes to that because we can never understand why God had to do it that way. But that's what the Rebbe chooses to say, that there will come a time when we'll be able to, I don't know if the word is understand it, but at least appreciate Hashem ki anafta bi. So when reading this, it becomes very clear that this is the ultimate. In other words, Chassidus is not happy with just saying, okay, we suffered, and now we come out of Mitzrayim or we come out of Golus, and we're ready to march to the Geula, and from here on, it's only going to be beautiful. It's not enough. We have to redeem 2,000 years of tsaros. There's no way. We have to elevate even the Helam. That's not enough just to say it's over and we'll go to party. You have to go back and transform the very darkness itself. There's no question. I mean, that to me seems like why Ayin Beis, after long 2 volumes of discussion all about the Giluyim, ultimately comes to the Einoid part, which is the greatest challenge of all. And that's really the central theme of this, of especially volume 3. The real punchline is that.
Why is the Ayin Dafka Megale the punchline, like you said? We understand that all the other things are having their own Giluyim, and that's nothing compared to the Etzem. But
the simple answer is because Atzmus is not defined by any Shiur, by any shape or form. So the greatest Giluyim, they can only reveal to you godliness in shape and form or in some expression. It's only something that is completely no shape and form, ayin, that can reveal pure atzmos. That's the usual explanation. To put it in more Avedidika terms, when the Rebbe speaks about Kabbalah sale of an Eved, he doesn't Eved Poshet. He doesn't understand, he doesn't feel. All he's doing is fulfilling Ratzon Hashem. In some ways, that reveals more etzem than all the Giluyim. We still need Giluyim. Don't forget. The Eibishter wants the etzem begili. So we definitely need expression. And it's not to negate all the Avedis Hashem that a person has to have in Teira and in using Limud Teira and Ava V'yira. But if you want etzem, to use the expression from the Rebbe Shaina Rabba Mem Daled, when the Rebbe was crying uncontrollably, and he kept on saying that Golas doesn't make any sense. Vikum ta'idin Golas. Why should Golas continue on? And then the Rebbe, Mamish sobbing, says the following words. He said, the only way you can explain it is maybe because the Eibishter Vilm is Oshrei Mitanemes. And if there'd be any explanation for Golas, the advantage of Golas, we wouldn't cry with the emes, because we'd have an explanation. In other words, if someone can come to explain that Golas has this and this mila, and this quality, then there's an explanation. So the only way a person cries without any complete crying with a real emes is only possible when there's no explanation at all. In other words, the true amunah and betachin is only when there's no giluyim at all. That's essentially what the Rebbe said then. That's one of the explanations. There's a lot more to say on this. We'll learn about it more. We're going to learn in Ayin Beis. He's going to discuss this. He discussed it already. If you go back, we talked about the Sheirish HaKelim is higher than Sheirish HaEris. There's one very powerful page, which I've referred to a number of times. I don't even remember what page it's now. I have to go back. Quite a while back.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
What does he say?
Yeah, it's on page, I have it here, on page 1270. Aleph Reish Ayin Reish, where he explains ultimately why the Rishimu is higher than the Kav, why the Kalim are higher than it. So he says that at the end of the day, Giluyim, Mitzias Ha'er is Musig B'Sechlenu, whereas Mitzias HaKelim, Helam, is not. In other words, it's completely understandable that God would reveal himself in all kinds of beautiful ways. But the fact that you have that God conceals himself, the concealment reveals something, is not a revelation. So the only thing is telling us that Atzmus is beyond Giluyim. Check out page 1270. It could help understand this piece. Plus other places as well.
This is a very high price. Yeah, you're right. The Tzoles, like you said, from the Rabbi Svedel to Ben Tzvi, is bringing you to the situation that there's no explanation for the Golos. This is a very, very high price.
Yeah, even when you say Yirid Tzedek Aliyah, for example, that's still an explanation. You could say, okay, this Yirid is to bring an Aliyah. But the Rebbe always says, who says we needed the Eibishter could do it a different way? Look, no one should ever suffer, and no one should ever experience tragedy. But those who have know there's a point there where there's no Giluyim, you're just completely at loss, and you just have to get through it. And it's not like you come back with answers. You get strength, you grow from it. But to say that somebody can go into that dark, dark, dark place and say, I understand why we need darkness. So that alone tells you that there's a level from Atzmus that is beyond Giluyim altogether. Now, unfortunately, it takes on the shape sometimes of the darkness in the wrong way. But remember, Helema Atzmi is darkness, that's a healthy darkness. It's a darkness higher than Giluyim, not lower than Giluyim. The thing is, the darkness that's lower than revelation is rooted in the darkness that's higher than revelation. Yoshes Cheshach Sisrei, it says.
What is the difference between Yiddish Tzoles and Goyish Tzoles, like the Goyim and Ukraine?
Listen, we're going a little off the.
No. I think that the difference is.
I know. I understand you missed me. You're bringing all your questions, but is it gay to the Maimah here?
I think so, because the Yiddish Tzoles brings you more to realize, to be connected to Hashem. You know that it's always you have no answers, and it's only Hashem, Helam Atzmi. The boy is not thinking like this. I think that's a difference.
I don't know. Why would you say that? If a non-Jew suffers a terrible tragedy, loses a child, God forbid, or any other tragedy, why is that less of a...
Because he's not concluding it with connecting that this is Hashem's...
I don't know. I mean, there are some people that are not Jewish that learn Ayin Beis in this class. I don't know if why can't they understand this concept?
That's a good point. Maybe because they don't have an neshama, but you're right.
I don't know. You're sounding very racist.
I don't know. The Rabbi said once time that there is not the Malchus.
Okay, what's that? But this is not the topic here. Okay. To me, if this is an explanation for anybody that any form of darkness, I wouldn't make this distinction in this place right now.
Okay. But the bottom line is Ayin.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yeah.
Specifically about what we just learned today, it was always my understanding, and it's probably a misunderstanding, or I don't understand it properly, but when Zohar comes into Malchus, sends into Malchus, I thought there was an additional step required for Malchus that is now containing Zohar, so to speak, to go down, to descend into even Atik of Beriah. I didn't think that Beriah was already within I thought there was a Malchus Atzilus alone that does not include, just has a Zohar that comes in it and does not connect to the eastern wall.
That's correct. That is true. But then there's a deeper level where Malchus does connect the two. Okay. You're right. What you're talking about is Malchus and Atzilus. We learned this, that Malchus is not yet going down into Beriah. So then Malchus is drawing from Zohar and ultimately will draw and be Mamshech in Beriah. But there's another part of Malchus, which he's discussing here, which is a deeper level. Malchus has several different levels. That's for sure. But he's now talking about Malchus in its purest form. Look, if you recall, in the beginning of this volume, and I discussed it a number of times, he brings from Eitz Chaim 7 aliyahs in Malchus. So think of the moon. The full moon, for example, is not this level. The full moon is when Malchus stands side by side with Zohar and is shining brightly. What he's talking now is the new moon, where Malchus is completely zero, Ayin. And the new moon has another dimension, like a Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, we're going to read the Shabbos. That this is a Chiddush, this is a whole different level. So in Malchus itself, it's true, we have different levels. We're jumping the gun here a bit. He's going to explain now that Malchus, he's going to explain now how Malchus comes into being, how Malchus is different than the other spheres. We need to understand that, I think, before answering your question fully. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
So let's learn inside. Let's learn now. He's going to explain how Malchus was created. Now, keep in mind that each of the, but I'm going to, just as an introduction, when Hashem was Maitzil, or the spheres were Netzalim, imparted or emanated the spheres, so there's Chochmah, there's Bina, there's Das, all the way to Malchus. So he's going to explain now that Malchus was shaped differently was created and shaped differently than all the other 9 spheres. That's what he's going to explain now. And which is going to also come to help us understand in many ways what we're discussing here about the level of Ayin, Leslam Gamok Klum, which of course is a very powerful statement that something doesn't have anything of its own. So here's what he says. V'hini Yedua, so the line I'm up to is the line Zulas Ma. Okay, so he says, V'hini Yedua, now it's known. The Binyan Malchus, that the structure or the building of Malchus, the way Malchus was built, Lies bebchinas Parzuf, the way Malchus was built to become a structure. Remember, Malchus is an entity, but it's very different, as we're going to learn, than the others. So the Binyan Malchus, Lies bebchinas Parzuf, Nasirak, Mahates Malchi is the test sphere is the Zoh. So it wasn't created as an entity of its own. Like, for example, you talk about Yesoid or Chesed. Let's talk Chesed is an easy one. Chesed is an entity called love. It has parameters. It has definition. It's not Gvura. and so on. So chesed was God emanated from his kindness into a thing called chesed. That's God's chesed, God's kindness. But what does it mean, Malchus? What is Malchus? What did God emanate exactly? So he's saying that it receives its energy from the Tes Malchus, the 9 levels of Malchus, from the Tes spheres of Zoh. So let's just break this down. Zoh consists of, remember, Zohar Ampin is Chesed through Yesod. 6 midas. Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Ched, Yesod, Malchus. So what does he mean by Tes spheres the Zoh? So it means in Zoh itself, you have the Chochmah Sheba Chesed, you have the Bina Sheba Chesed, you have the Dash Sheba Chesed, you have all the way to Yesod Sheba Chesed. So, and then there's the Malchus of each one of these test spheres, these 9 spheres. So you have 9 from the 9 spheres. In other words, the Malchus of Chochmah Sheba Chesed then goes becomes the ingredient that builds Malchus of Atzilus. The Malchus of Gvura of Zoh becomes the Malchus, becomes the Gvura Sheba Malchus becomes also another component in Malchus. So Malchus is not made of any its own entity. All it is revelation of the 9 levels of Malchus in these 9 spheres in Zoh. Understood? So you have to. I'll spell it out again. The 9 spheres in Zoh means Chochmah through. Now, why does he say 9, not 10? Because it's the Malchus is that becomes Malchus of Atzilus. That's why he calls it 9. The Malchus of each of the 9. Tes Malchus, the Tes sphere is the Zoh.
Yeah, because he's talking about the Malchus from the 9 spheres. Malchus is the 10.
Like I said, Malchus of Chochmah Sheba Chesed, Malchus of Bina Sheba Chesed, Malchus of Dash Sheba Chesed, etc. However, he calls it Zoh. So really it would be Malchus of Chochmah Sheba Zoh, Malchus of Bina Sheba Zoh. Let me correct myself. I said Chesed, because that would be 9 times 6. That would be 45. So it's basically, Zoh is a whole entity. There's Chochmah Sheba Zoh, there's Malchus and Chochmah Sheba Zoh, there's Malchus and Bina Sheba Zoh, Malchus and Dash Sheba Zoh, etc. Now, obviously, you could probably immediately surmise that these are the Tes Malchus that we say in Rosh Hashanah when we make Binyan Malchus. So when we say the Malchus of Keren and Shefris, we say 9 psukim, 9 Malchus, 9 verses that reflect these. These are the 9 Malchus. Ki b'seid shedish, because in its root. So let me explain what means seid shedish. In the root, seid shedish. Seid means secret, but seid shedish sometimes means seid shedish, seid tasteless. In the seid shedish, it's the language of Kabbalah. Netzola rak nekuda achas. Because in the actual root, Malchus almost only emanated one nekuda, 1 point, which is like the nekuda of the Keren Zovis, 1 point. What is the point? Keser Malchus. Keser Malchus was 1 point. However, you want to build Malchus, we said Binyan Malchus into a Partzuf. So how do you take 1 point and turn it into a full entity? So that's where Malchus derives its energies from the 9 levels. In addition to Keser Malchus, its root, it now receives, like I said, Malchus of Chochmah Sheba Zoh and Bina Sheba Zoh, etc., the 9 that he just mentioned. That's what appears like he's saying. I know it's very brief, but that seems to be what the Rebbe Rashab is trying to say here. Ulechein, and therefore, kishetzricha lachze ponim beponim. Okay, I need to again stop and give us some explanation here. You may recall we learned earlier that there's 2 forms of yichud, acher ba'acher and ponim beponim. Let's say when Adam and Chava were created, they were created as one androgynous creature, back to back, male and female. The Eibishter separated them. It's called the Nesira. And then when they joined together, they become like one flesh as husband and wife. then they face each other, panim b'panim. So Chassidus explains the yichud acher ba'acher. We talked about yichud chitzeni of Abba ve'ima, and yichud pnimi. The yichud pnimi is panim b'panim. It's face to face. Now Malchus, because Malchus is the last sphere, and it's like the nekeva, the female, on its own, it's the only thing it has from Zoh is only the back. That's why the moon on its own doesn't have any light of its own. However, you want Malchus to be elevated, like he said, Binyan and Malchus, that it should be a full partzuf and it should be able to face Zoh, its male counterpart, face to face. So you say B'Seid Shadish, in the root of it, it's only Kesef Malchus. It's a state of darkness. It's a state of a nekuda. Like but when you wanted to return face to face, Nasis nekuda tachis yisod, then it becomes like a nekuda. The nekuda of Malchus tachis yisod, which is yisod, is the final of the 6 level spheres of Zoh. Because it's at its core, it's only a point. The nivn is beparts of shalom, and it's built into a full structure, into a complete structure. The Esesphiris, with Esesphiris, mites malchi is the Zoh, from the tes malchis that we just described from Zoh. So basically, to put it in simple terms, Malchus begins as a nekuda. All the other spheres don't begin as a nekuda. They begin a full entity. Chesed is chesed, gvura is gvura. Malchus begins as a nekuda, but then it gets filled and saturated, it gets filled up and built up through the 9 levels of Malchus, the 9 Malchis in Zoh. Like I said before, Malchus the Chochma de Zoh, Nasa Chochma Sheba Malchus. There we have it. From Malchus of Chochma of Zoh, that builds Chochma Sheba Malchus. So Malchus is no longer just a nekuda. Malchus the Bina de Zoh, and from Malchus the Bina of Zoh, Nasa Bina Sheba Malchus. Now we have Bina in Malchus. So I want to just explain it maybe because it can be somewhat esoteric. Let me explain it based on a derech mitzvah. There's a mitzvah minoi melech, the appointment of a king. So Tzemach Tzedek explains there from the Alter Rebbe, my Marim, very interesting concept. What is a melech ultimately? A king in Judaism is not someone who is the wealthiest, the wisest, the most powerful. He explains there that a melech is the one that is most humble. Like David HaMelech said, Anochi shavisi v'deimamti. He was completely silenced and completely nullified. Moshe Rabbeinu, Anov Mikol Adam, v'nachnu ma. In other words, the leaders in Yiddishkeit were not defined by their greatness, but by their bittul, by their nothingness. They sense that they're nothing on their own. He explains there at length why David HaMelech is ultimately the king and Shaul HaMelech is Bina. Bina is understanding. Shaul was a great king, but his identity was one of Giluyim. And David was the opposite, was a Bar Nafla. Initially, he was not going to live. It was only as a gift of the 70 years given to him by the Adam HaRishon and the Oves. Why? Because David didn't have any mitzias of his own. Utter bittul, like Malchus, like the moon. The sun is a bright, shining star. It shines. The moon doesn't have anything of its own. So the kings of Israel, Malchus, real Malchus, has nothing of its own. And yet, we see that David HaMelech had wisdom. Shlomo HaMelech, Chacham Mikol Adam, was considered the wisest of all. So how do you reconcile that? So the explanation, like he says here, is, and its be'etzem Malchus has nothing of its own. But then it receives Chachma and Bina and Das and all the other 9 spheres from the levels of the Malchus, of the higher levels, but it's not on its own. It's getting it from the sun, so to speak. So that's the reconciliation. The bittul always remains. When you talk about the other spheres, their definition, not that they're yesh, but they have identity. Chesed, Abal Chesed. Avram Avinu was Chesed. He wasn't Malchus. He also had Bitla, Noichi, Ofer, Ve'efer. They all have Bitl. We're not taking away. Bitl exists in every level. But Malchus, it personifies and embodies literally Bitl in the fullest sense of the word. Nothing of its own. Literally nothing of its own. And yet it receives from the higher levels these Giluim. So besides Sherish, its root is nothingness. And yet it then receives the other Giluim, like he explains here. But the Giluim also coming from the level of Malchus, of each level. That's what he's explaining here. Now, it's very dense and very brief here. That's why we need to bring other places, other Maimarim, where it's explained more at length. But that's what he wants. One second, let me just finish. Okay. That's why this is ultimately making the case why Malchus is like Keren. It's not a dover b'fnei atzmi. It's not an entity of its own. All it is going to connect things, but it's on its own does not have any mitzias of its own. Just I wanted to read one more line, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Let me just see here. 1 second. What did I want to read? Yeah, let me just read one more line. So, the Malchus in each sphere, meaning the Malchus of Chachma of Zah, who b'chinas seiv v'siyum, the Chol sphere is the end and the end point of every sphere. The b'chinas hagilu shalah, which means is the level of the gili of that sphere. U'kamoshin is bar le'il dibra maschil vayigash elov. Like we learned earlier in the Maimer Vayigash in volume 2. So in other words, where does Malchus of Atzilus get Chachma, Bina, and so on? It gets it from the Malchus of Chachma, not from Chachma directly. The Malchus of Chachma of Zah, the Malchus of Bina of Zah, the Gilui of each sphere, that ultimately starts giving life and structure to Malchus that on its own has no structure. And that's the Partsuf that's built of Malchus to become Panim Bepanim, the Malchus, the structure of Malchus. So on its own is Bittul, Ayin, but then it receives the light of the sun, in this case from Malchus, the Gilui of Chochma of Zah, Bina of Zah, Das of Zah, etc. That's what he said so far, what we learned inside. I'm going to stop here anyway, but we can stop here for questions. Yeah.
So my question was, can one say that the power of Malchus is dafka in its bittul and its emptiness, if you, I wouldn't say nothingness, but emptiness, in the sense that because it's empty, it can channel a lakus from this higher level and bring down essentially more powerful lakus than, let's say, the more limited nature of the spheres above it, which are distinct in their personality, whereas Malchus of Atzilus is drawing down from all these different Malchios of Zah, and therefore it essentially is empowered by its emptiness, if you will, and that enables it to channel a greater amount of light than the sphere of the other sphere of Atzilus. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is, and he said it explicitly on page 1300 when he talked about Evet. That's exactly the level of Evet, correct?
Thank you.
And he's going to explain it more at length as we go on. We're still in the middle of this, but that's ultimately part of the understanding of it all. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions?
So is that why Hashem created Adam and Chava achor la'achor in the beginning? I mean, you would think there was no need for that. Why didn't he just do it panim al panim to begin with? What was that extra creation if there was no
yeah, there are long Maimarim that explain this at length. It is somewhat like that. It's the same reason he created the diminished moon. Everything begins first in a state of diminishment, and then the goal is through our avodah. Remember, it takes avodah to get to panim bepanim. So that's correct. It all begins within a diminished state, and then the goal is to go to a deeper connection.
But with the moon, it's my understanding that it was created originally as the same, not a diminished state, diminished after its actions of complaining to Hashem. Why, we can't have two kings with one crown, so to speak. So the moon was created already in an exalted state. Whereas here, it seems like Chava was, and there was no connection at all. So there was total, I guess guess you would say Adam would have the 9 other test spherot in him, even when he was in the beginning created, Akar La'akar, whereas Chava in the back of him had nothing at all. So that was a completely, that was how she was created.
I don't know if I would say that. I have to see inside if it says anywhere that. But overall, even the moon. So the question is, so why does the Zohar say that the moon has nothing of its own if it was created like a huge luminary? Because at the end of the day, once the moon got diminished, that was its real entity at that point. It's true, it had an element of greatness in the beginning, but you could ask the question, if it's Malchus, and Malchus is a Nakuda, so how did the moon have its full size like it was the sun initially? So really the question is the other way around. So I think in the beginning of Ayin Beis here in volume 3, when he brought from the Eitz Chaim, I think he discussed it to some extent. I have to look it up. But bottom line is that we count the moon from once it's diminished. We don't count how it was as it was created. I'd have to look on page 1208 to 1209. He speaks about this, about the level of the moon, Malchus. But if you want to know more about this, I would go back to page 1208 and 1209. As far as Adam and Chava goes, it's not, I don't know, I have to look it up. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there's no question that everything begins in a kuda. Could be this the way you described it, it could be not, I'm not sure. Yeah, because the Alter Rebbe Rashab is being very brief here. I have to really look up in detail what he means by panim b'panim and all that. I'm just calling upon some of my memory banks that I learned in other places, but I really need to look it up inside to really go into more detail. So I'll do that when I can, and I'll come back to you. How's that?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
There is an eter, if you look in Tofresh Ayin, there's a whole piece where he talks about the Nesira. This is the Nesira, the separation of Adam and Chava. So there are Maimorim that talk about it at length. There's a whole sefer also from Isaac Homler called Shnei Me'eris, which means the 2 luminaries, where he has pages upon pages about this topic. I think there's even a sikha from the Rebbe in maybe volume Lamed Hey, 35, Kutei Sichas and Bereshis, where he also speaks about it. So I'll just give you some sources if you want to look up this. The ideas are discussed in these places. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. It's good to be back again. We're getting right into it. Ayin Beis can definitely keep you on your toes, keep your mind and heart healthy. So actually, we're coming to more or less, I think we learned a little more. I don't remember exactly where we stopped, but somewhere in the middle of this page, I remember that we stopped. But it's fine. It's well worth reviewing it again. You see, it's quite dense. So I'm going to stop here before the parentheses, L'chein Iskalus on page